Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Edible Ed 101. It's great to be here this evening. We've got a wonderful class about native food sovereignty with some of the leaders in that field, including Professor Elizabeth Hoover, who we're delighted to have join us this evening. As you know, this is a class about edible education, and we have the privilege to invite some of the leading thinkers and doers, entrepreneurs, action change makers in the food system joining us every week. We've also got a strata of homework that you've been pursuing that focuses on our own place in the food system, helping us gain awareness of what we eat, what values we bring to eating. And there's also a theme of entrepreneurship underlying everything. And the first assignment was to keep a food diary and to reflect on your eating habits. And that is really a skill set that we think of as tracking. It's really important to learn how to track and reflect. Those are two key capabilities that entrepreneurs and change makers bring to their work. So tracking really begins to build the muscle of pattern recognition. Once you start to develop pattern recognition around occurrences and interdependencies and relationships in a system, you can start to diagnose where you might want to make change in a system. And this last week, we focused on sourcing. Where does our favorite meal come from? So we're now going from the me, we're kind of looking at what do I eat and how does it connect to the greater system? And so we're going to start today with a new tool that we've discovered, that Eva has discovered, that's a word cloud. We'd like you to go to the chat, and we're going to post a link for a live word cloud. And we're going to ask you to choose 1 to 3 words to describe your, that summarize your approach to how you source your foods that you eat. So 1 to 3 words that summarize how you source your foods. So Eva has posted the link menti.com and use the code 3625075. And we will see the word cloud form in real time in front of us. We need some kind of great music with this, Eva. We're going to have to save this for Alice because she would be so thrilled to see that big occurrence of organic and local in the center. That's pretty amazing. All right. Well, this will be worth studying. Thanks, Eva. Let's come back and we'll now do a poll. Thank you, everyone. We'll save that and we will share it with our weekly announcement. Now, I would like to do a little poll. I'll run the poll here. This is, remember, important for you to participate in this if you're taking the class for credit, because this is how we take attendance. So from your homework assignment, how would you describe the supply chain you had to trace to discover the path of origin of your favorite meal? It was easy to trace, highly transparent, was challenging to trace, somewhat transparent, difficult to trace, almost opaque, and almost impossible to trace, opaque. Okay, we've got about 125. Just keep it a few more seconds, Eva. And we have a number of guests here too. All right. I will share the results with you. It looks like about 40% said that it was challenging to trace, somewhat transparent or opaque. 12% of you said it was almost impossible to trace. So one of the reasons for this poll is to, again, in terms of thinking entrepreneurially, is the more we learn about a system and we learn about its weaknesses or risks or gaps, the more likely we are to be able to identify a solution or an innovation to address that problem. And when we bring insight, when we bring multidisciplinary skills, understanding of policy or health or climate or technology, we might be equipped to begin to address transparency in a supply chain. And there are some very interesting new technologies in terms of blockchain and different testing protocols that are starting to be used. We'll be talking about those later on in the semester. So without further ado, I want to reintroduce to you one of our co-curators this semester to help frame the class a little bit more today. Please welcome Nikiko Masamoto. Hi, Nikiko.
Thanks, Will. So great to be back. I have the beautiful task of pausing for a second with everyone and taking a look back at where we've been so far. So it's been a while since I've been a student. And so this is such a great reminder to me of the labor of learning. And so I want to do a small weaving exercise that I try to do at different points when you're in a course like this, where we're having so many different voices. It's a survey of so many different approaches to food. So I just want to read off the names of the people and a few words of who we've been with so far. So our opening class, right, was with Chef Bryant Terry, and we had a cooking demo with Rahana. And I think about the lasting words. I remember Bryant Terry read that great poem about rice. And there was this one moment where he was talking about the inauguration and the power of trusting Black women. That moment really stuck with me. And then I remember from Rahana, her amazing piece of advice to garnish the bottom of the plate before serving food, and her beautiful crispy fried plantains. The next week, we had Alice Waters and Al Gore talking about climate change. For me, the moment that stood out was when Al Gore at the end talked about the mission to the moon under President Kennedy, and the fact that the average age of the scientists who made that possible was in the early 20s. And so thinking about really like the role you all right now in your lives can play in reshaping our food systems. That was really powerful to me. Then the next week was the week I got to curate, bringing in the voices of Mein Wen, organic grain farmer. And she started a conversation that I know we're going to pick up today, thinking about healing in the context of colonialism, right? And she talked about her own personal family history as a Vietnamese American. And she had that amazing moment where she shared that healing the food system meant healing herself too, and her body. We had People's Kitchen Collective, Jocelyn Jackson and Sita Baumick, talking about community organizing, cultural organizing, and the power of feeding people. And they did that amazing review of the Black Panther Party's deep community dedication to food sovereignty, which we're going to pick up again today in our conversation. And for me, one of the lasting moments was Jocelyn talking about the power of service to community. Then last week we had Saru Jayaraman talking so passionately about community organizing and data around the people who were at the core of the problems in the tipping industry in the restaurant. And what an amazing example of the way in which academia and research can serve people whose political power has been diminished. And so we listened to her, and I particularly did not know about the direct correlation between the history of slavery and the tipping policy, the way that white restaurant owners use tipping as a way to, in fact, keep Black people without wages, and how that history has continued today. So powerful. And we had two folks, Jesse and Lenore from the San Francisco New Deal, talking in real time about this past year and the way that they've used their tools of pivoting, of inventing community networks and pivoting the way restaurants functioned to feed people. Really powerful examples of peers doing good work. So that brings us to today. And I am so honored to be in this space this evening to hear first from Elizabeth Hoover. And in preparing for this evening, I was struck by listening to some of Elizabeth's talks and at other universities and other institutions about the way she also, like Saru, centers community and Native people in research and collecting data and story, not in service of her own ego, but in fact in service of community, of people, of Native peoples. And so I am really looking forward to hearing about the power of healing, of seeds, and learning from her this evening. So her formal introduction: Elizabeth Hoover is an associate professor in the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department here at UC Berkeley. And Elizabeth's work focuses on food sovereignty and environmental justice for Native communities. Her first book, The River is in Us: Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, published in 2017, is an ethnographic exploration of Aguanasunse, forgive me for pronunciation, Mohawk response to Superfund contamination in environmental health research. And then her second book, which I believe is still in process, is From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds: Indigenizing the Local Food Movement. And if you want to peek of that work, Elizabeth has produced this incredible blog of her travels across the country to document, collect stories, and learn about Native seed keepers, gardeners, farmers. So I am so touched by Elizabeth's dedication to community-centered research and cannot wait to hear from her this evening. So Elizabeth, thank you for being here.
All right, nice to see you all. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. So my goal tonight, because the real geniuses are the ones waiting in the wings here to give you this amazing cooking demonstration after. So basically, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context for the broader movement that really surrounds and is upheld by the work of our fantastic Native chefs like Vincent and Lewis, who are on the call class Zoom video with us here tonight. So as Nikiko mentioned, my work right now is really centered around Native American food sovereignty movements, projects, seeds, chefs, all things delicious in Indian country. And so my goal tonight is just to kind of give you a brief background of what is the Native American food sovereignty movement, where are its roots, where arose the need for a grassroots movement like this, and how are chefs fitting into this movement. So here on this slide, we have Chef Brian Yazzie, who is a Diné or Navajo chef who works out of Minneapolis. You can follow him, his Yazzie the Chef tagline there. And here he's doing an event alongside the Sioux chef in Minneapolis. This is one of the heirloom corns. It's a Haudenosaunee white corn that is used for a lot of soups and breads and corn mush, which is kind of like a porridge. And this was grown in the Onondaga community. And then this is Rowan White, who is one of our dearest favorite seed keepers. She's a Mohawk seed keeper who actually lives a few hours north of here, where she manages the Sierra Seed Cooperative. Okay, there were. So food sovereignty. La Via Campesina is an international peasant organization that operates all over the world at this point, that works to represent land-based people who are fighting for food sovereignty, which they define as the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So this is seen as a bit different than food security, which is, are you getting enough calories on a consistent basis? It's a little different from food justice, which is really the fight for everyone to have equal access to this food system that we have in this country. People advocating for food sovereignty are saying, like, okay, we don't just want an equal piece of the pie, we want the right to define our own pie, to bake our own pie, essentially. And then this right here, I've loved taking photos of hands and seeds, as you may have noticed. So this is my friend Kenny Perkins, who's from Akwesasne, who's holding some Mohawk red bread corn here, which is from this field, which is behind me here, hiding the rest of my life. This is a whole field of Mohawk heirloom corn behind me. So in thinking about food sovereignty, it has just all been kind of condensed into this definition. Some people have said, well, for indigenous communities, food sovereignty is a little more specific. So people don't just want access to land, they want their land and their food system. So indigenous food sovereignty is about recognizing social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing and that need to be nurtured. And it really highlights those sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based food and political systems. And as you can see from these beautiful girls who are part of the Yuchi language instruction project, it starts with youth, with instilling youth with this sense of relationality to these seeds, to each other, to the food system. So here is a whirlwind tour of what are some of the challenges to indigenous food and seed systems. What necessitated this food sovereignty movement needing to come about. And it starts on the East Coast, where I just came from and where my family's from, with scorched earth battle tactics, with really the intentional destruction of indigenous food systems. So in the 1600s, it was the French who came through and set fire to Haudenosaunee cornfields as a way of politically weakening that confederacy. And then George Washington did similar in late 1700s, when he commanded General Sullivan to lay waste to their settlements. So basically to burn, and they burned hundreds of acres of field, and soldiers wrote about the millions of bushels of corn and beans and squash that people had set aside to have food for the coming winter, and it was all burned as a way of politically weakening Haudenosaunee people. Similarly, for Navajo Diné people in the Four Corners, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah area, they were rounded up and taken to a concentration camp called Bosque Redondo in the 1860s. And for those who didn't willingly go, Kit Carson and his men set fire to their orchards, to their sheep. Here in California, there was very much the intentional destruction of people and of food systems, again, as a way of eradicating and making room for settler farmers to replace people on this land. So in addition to the destruction of food systems, there was the theft of land and relocation of tribal communities in order to make room for settler farmers. So people have probably heard of the Trail of Tears, where Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole people and others were taken out of the Southeast and marched on a death march out to Oklahoma. And people were relocated from states all over to Oklahoma in order to open up that land. And when you are taken from a space as different as the mountains of North Carolina off to Oklahoma, it's a very different food system. It's different soil, it's different climate. So even if people had the opportunity to pack up their seeds, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would grow well once they got to Oklahoma. The Dawes Act in 1887 took communally held land that Native people had in many places and divided it up into individual parcels so that the excess land could be sold to settlers. So that also diminished the land base from which people could tap into for their food systems. The boarding school system forcibly took children from their Native communities and sent them to schools away from their parents so that they would be re-educated to farm like white people, to eat like white people. And so that also damaged access to traditional food knowledge. The Bureau of Indian Affairs really pushed Western farming methods and seeds on communities. So even people like the Hopi, like the Zuni, who had been farming for thousands of years and doing so in a way that was adapted to the environment there, the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, no, you need to take on our hybrid seeds and these kind of irrigation models, which didn't end up working. And then the soil became oversalinated and they were like, oh, I guess maybe you guys were onto something with the previous techniques you had been using. Some contemporary challenges, climate change. If you have seeds that are very well adapted to the land that you're on, some years it's really wet now, some years it's really dry. Sometimes the frost comes early and late, so that has made it challenging. People are concerned about cross-contamination with genetically modified seeds. Some communities, there's a lack of access to land, to tools, to seed. And there's a real effort to try to get people interested again in wanting to grow food. So what happens when you have a dramatically altered food system like this? There are health impacts, there are economic impacts. So prior to the 1940s, there were very few cases of type 2 diabetes in Native communities, and now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people, who are 249% more likely to die of diabetes-related health conditions than other Americans. And there's also economic impacts. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey among their community members and found that people spent $8 million a year on food, $7 million which was spent off reservation. So these are the grim, depressing statistics that around, what has led to these problems with the food system and what have some of the impacts been. But, so I start with the grim, depressing statistics, but it's not like Native people are just laying around dying, waiting to be overtaken by metabolic disorders and poverty. People are working very hard to improve health, to improve economic situations, and to start projects to try to help community members do this. So I became really interested in this idea of food sovereignty when I was living in Akwesasne, and I was working with this group called Kanahio Yungoya Dohage, which is We Are Planting Good Seeds. And it's a grassroots community-based effort to try to get more people into growing heirloom seeds, planting their own gardens, having their own backyard chickens. And as part of doing this work, we would, be all day weeding and taking care of animals, and then at night going, I wonder how other communities are doing this. How are people getting funding? How are they getting youth involved? How are these projects getting off the ground in other communities? So this led me to a bunch of different Indigenous food summits where people were coming together from all over the country to present about their projects like this. And so I thought, all right, I've met all these cool people at conferences. Now I want to see these projects in person and meet some other people who are working on the ground like this. So I got a little bit of funding from the university. I used to teach at Brown University in Rhode Island. And I jumped in the car and drove 20,000 miles around the country over about 4 months and stopped into about 40 different communities and interviewed people who were doing these on the ground grassroots farming, gardening, food sovereignty projects. So I was specifically focused on farming and gardening because that's what I was familiar with from growing up. So there's lots of other food sovereignty projects that are really looking at foraging and wild food and fishing and hunting and all these things, but I was specifically looking at farming and gardening. And then the Kiko mentioned I have this blog that I started, From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds. And part of that was because the academic publishing process takes so long. As your professor will tell you, it takes quite some time between when you first interview people and when you get an idea for a project and when the books and the articles actually come out. And so the blog was a way of showing people what each other was working on, because people were like, I wish I could just go visiting around the country for 4 months, but somebody's got to stay here and, take care of the gardens. And so they wanted kind of an eye on what everybody else was up to. And so that's part of what this blog was designed for, was to kind of be documenting as I went. And so the one article that has come out of this is called You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself, Defining and Enacting Food Sovereignty in American Indian Community Garden. Because one of the things that I was curious to know from people is, I read you earlier, the kind of one of the official definitions of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is a term that academics and activists are really keen on. But what did this mean to people who were working on the ground, who were taking care of all these gardens? And so when I asked people, like, how do you define food sovereignty? I then took all these answers and kind of, wrote them all out and put them in vivo, and then pulled out all these different themes. And in vivo is a qualitative analyzing software where that kind of helps you code things. And so really what came out of all these different definitions was a focus on the restoration of physical, cultural, and spiritual health as something that was very important to people who are running these food sovereignty projects. It was a desire to help people access culturally appropriate foods. So they're saying, it's not enough just that we can get, commodity food programs that make sure we have enough food. We want people to have our food specifically. It was about helping to build back up that relationship between people and each other as they were working together as part of these projects, between people and the land and people and the food. There was a focus on individual, community, and tribal self-sufficiency, economic independence. That kind of leads back to that survey I mentioned earlier, making sure people have access to this food, and a real focus on education, recognizing that if you're going to prompt people to really want to eat this food, you have to give them some very good reasons sometimes to want to take this up. And then again, because I was focusing specifically on farming and gardening, there was a real focus on the continuing and revitalizing the use of traditional heirloom seeds. So here's some of the beautiful corns and beans that people were focusing on, and a desire to bring back these seeds and to continue using these seeds because they're adapted to the land that people are working on, living on, interacting with, and also the genes within those seeds really connected people back to their ancestors. So every cob of corn, every little husk of beans looks the way it does because of series of decisions made by all the grandmas that came before you that selected which ones were going to be kept as seed. And so when you're holding that seed, when you're planting that seed, when you then the following season are deciding which seeds to keep, you're taking part in that ritual. And then, so part of the book, and maybe just because I really like eating, is thinking about, so you have people who are really working to revitalize the use of these seeds to get these gardens going, but you have to get people excited about eating this food again, right? So what is the role of Native chefs in the food sovereignty movement? And you're going to hear about some of that work when Vincent and Lewis come on. But that was, so in addition to this big road trip, I went around and interviewed about 30 different Native chefs. Cafe Ohlone, we missed that. I'm sure there will be another soon. Here's Sean Sherman cooking in the James Beard House. So yeah, it's a tough job having to go around and eat all of this delicious food, but somebody's got to do it, right? And so in talking to Native chefs at these different events and at these different dinners, learning more about the motivations to come to these events and to promote cooking specifically Indigenous food. So there are Indigenous people working in kitchens all over the country, but there's a cohort, a group of chefs that are really working to promote specifically their traditional food. And it was about cultural pride, about wanting to preserve foodways and techniques, recognizing that there's a real lack of representation of venues serving Native cuisine. So if you go to any city in the country, you can get food from all over the world, but what is the likelihood you can find a restaurant that represents the Indigenous people in that region? And then wanting to encourage and inspire the community and increase access to healthy food. And then part of what is really interesting to me is this idea of gastrodiplomacy, and how is that utilized as part of the work of these chefs in working to educate people through food. So this notion of winning hearts and minds through stomachs, right? And so when people in the food studies world talk about gastrodiplomacy, it's about the introduction of kind of foreign culture through cuisines that's seen as non-threatening. Like, oh, let's get people to like our country by setting up all these restaurants and showing them how amazing our food is. And thinking about how are Native chefs also utilizing this idea of bringing people in with beautiful food and then giving them an education that they may not even have expected, but will help the people to go away kind of more informed than maybe they anticipated. And this is where I'm going to leave it to Vincent and Lewis to talk about this, but I love sitting through all of their meals and hearing People came in, they see that there's this beautiful food, everything's flowers and colorful, and it's amazing. And as part of not just, getting this amazing meal, but they get a whole talk as well about the history of Ohlone people and what their relatives have been through, and the revitalization of language and how things are ongoing and beautiful. And then before you get your brownies, Vincent will inform you that you are now kind of obligated to go forth and be an ally, because you've got this information. And so now you have to correct people when you hear them say stupid things like, there are no more California Indians, or they used to speak their language, or they used to eat their food. So I think these guys use gastrodiplomacy in a really interesting and educational way. So just wrapping up, thinking about different levels of food sovereignty. On an individual level, the rights and responsibility over where your food comes from, what you're putting in your own mouth. On a community level, making sure that the whole community is getting enough to eat and is self-sufficient, but also thinking about not just human communities, but reciprocal relationships between human communities and animal communities and plant communities and bird communities and fish communities. How are all of those relationships being nurtured as part of a food system? And then on a political level, people are really pushing their tribal governments to make sure that they're providing enough food, but also that they're fighting federal policies that aren't supportive of local food systems, and fighting to maintain treaty rights that were signed by their ancestors to ensure access to traditional food. So if anybody's interested, here's another book that we put out, Devan Mahesoa and I, called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, that has chapters from everybody from lawyers to seed keepers to fisher people from all over the country. So there's another resource if you're interested in Indigenous food sovereignty. And I will hand it over here. I think I may have gone over my allotted few minutes, but I get very excited.
Okay, thank you, Liz, for what you just shared. Did you have any time for Q&A, or was that allocated within the schedule?
We can, why don't Vincent and Lewis, why don't you begin, and then we'll invite students to put some questions in chat, and then we can field those for you. How's that?
We're happy to get started. Thank you, Liz, for what you shared. It's always nice to hear from you. Elizabeth Hoover is a great friend of ours, and we're grateful to know her through Slow Foods Turtle Island, through traveling the world to promote indigenous foods. I'd like to start off by saying to all of you, Horshe Mor Ma Kam, Kanak Kat Vincent Medina, at Kanak Halkin Taresh. Nesa Kanakrote Akmakna Nerakat Luis Tervino, Waki Ramsin Taresh, at Nesa Makarote Halkin Warep, Horshe Warep, Manni Maksuyak Mehiswi Hementuhi. Nesa Akmaknanem Nonwente.
Nishihmur ime makam. Karakt Luis Trevino, ka itmai kakon tahoya achistai pire. In karukat Chia, misich halkin, imen takamoish, Vincent Medina. In kashunin in imme shatu shakai rote chiat, imen takamoish.
Okay. What Lewis and myself just shared in our respective Ohlone languages. Lewis spoke in Rumsen, which is the language of Carmel Valley, and I spoke in Chochenyo, which is the indigenous language of the East Bay, is good evening to you all, Horshemur. I'm grateful to be able to be here with my partner, Lewis, to speak about our efforts with our community and work that's led by our elders to see our traditional foods grow stronger. We'd like to acknowledge this place that we're speaking to you from, Halkin Warep, which is about 15 miles south of Berkeley. And this is the space that every generation of our family has always lived, from those ancient days before colonization and before the invasion to where we're at today in 2021, and surely where our community will be in the future as well. Behind us, there's Makarume, Iswirume, San Lorenzo Creek, which is about just a few blocks from where we're speaking to you from. And this creek has always sustained my people, our people. And our ancestors have long fished along it, have long gathered salt, mussels, clams, and shellfish, right? Along the bay shore, building massive shell mounds in this place. In the upper reaches, gathering acorns, gathering bay nuts and hazelnuts, all these good foods that we still love and cherish today. Our ancestors from thousands of years lived along this space, but our great-grandparents and our grandparents and our parents also grew up in this space as well. That allows us to be here, to be able to keep our culture strong and to be able to see healing happen as well. I'm going to share a presentation, so we could, would somebody please mind just making me an administrator so I could share? But so you could see some of this work that we're doing with your own eyes. This work that we're doing, it's work that's long been happening by our family, to be able to see healing happen, to be able to see revival happen as well. And long before we came onto the scene, meaning Lewis and myself, our family has been doing this work consistently to see healing, to be able to see those things that have been continued grow stronger. And for certain aspects of our culture that couldn't be continued because of how hard our culture was impacted, to see those things healed. We learn from those people, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our parents, our aunties, our uncles. We see how much they love all of these ways. And as young people growing up, that inspired us as well to want to follow in their footsteps, to be able to be part of this healing and also this continuity that only comes from love for our culture. Before we talk about our food, we need to explain a little bit about the abundance and also the diversity that's traditional here in California. So what you see right here, this map, this is only of the Ohlone area. The Ohlone area is going from Vallejo throughout all of the east, throughout the inner East Bay, excuse me, and it jets into part of the outer East Bay. Throughout San Francisco and the peninsula, going through San Jose, Santa Cruz area, all the way down to Monterey, Big Sur. Now, we've never been just one tribe, but a series of multiple independent nations. In the past, they've been called tribes or tribelets. We don't prefer that because for us, calling them nations, that is more encompassing of their sovereignty and of the political landscape that's traditional here. But 54 different independent nations that dot this landscape, speaking at least 8 different languages and dozens of different dialects. And that abundance that's here and diversity, and able to coexist in a world of plenty, but still be able to have interactions in this complex, meaningful way. That's something that we cherish and that we value, even to this day. Where I'm speaking to you from, Lewis, as well, it's Halkin Irhin, which is right here again in this independent nation that my family directly descends from. Now, if you look at where the blue arrow is at, that's the Rumsen Ohlone area, where Lewis's ancestors come from. Now, being able to know that we speak different languages, that we have different centers of the world, different places that we believe that our world began, different places that we go to make offerings to pray to, different basketry traditions, some cases different foods because of the regional differences and the huge amounts of biodiversity. That meant that there were always differences that existed here. This area has always been diverse and cosmopolitan, but also our ancestors were also able to see the commonalities that our people shared, were able to love one another, intermarry with one another, trade with one another, have ceremony, have big time together. And those ways we still cherish even to this day. Our families, for an example, in mine and Lewis's family, they interacted many times before we met. They interacted in the 1800s when our ancestors were enslaved at Mission Dolores. They interacted in the 1940s or 50s, 50s at the Sonora Rancheria when Lewis's family was violently evicted by white settlers coming into Carmel Valley and forced them away from their homeland out of the name of greed, and came to the Pleasanton Rancheria, where my family was living, and there was safety there. And then, of course, came together with our families nowadays. But that shows, again, that way of being and that way of existing, which is something that we value. If you look just to the East Bay, this is the traditional political landscape of the East Bay. And again, not just one tribe, but a series of different nations, a series of different peoples, and again, speaking multiple languages. So here in this area, Halkine, we're Chochenyo, Ohlone, and Miwok speakers. If you go into the Oakland Hills or the Berkeley Hills and go east of that, that's all a Miwok speaking area. If you go further east of that, that's all a Yokut speaking area. If you go to San Francisco, that's a Ramaytush speaking area. If you go to Marin County, that's a Coast Miwok speaking area. If you go just north to Napa, that's a Patwin speaking area. San Jose, Tamian speaking area. That ability to have so much diversity, again, this is something that's long been part of the California landscape. California has always been a diverse, cosmopolitan place. It's nothing new, but this is always how it's been here. Also, I'd like to acknowledge, just to start off, is that this area has a way of being, has an identity that predates white colonization and settlement. This area has languages that are indigenous, foods that are indigenous, a cuisine, and in some cases, multiple variations to that, depending where you're at. This area has a religion that's indigenous, an aesthetic, values, a way of carrying ourselves that's uniquely ours. This place has never been a new world, but this place is old. This place has been settled for thousands of years, and us, we're still here. Never left, never will. This is an image of our people from before. We look at these women in this painting, and they're our aunties, very literally. They come from areas that our family has direct ancestry to. This was painted in 1816. It's, the lithographs are held at the Bancroft Library, but it's a reminder of the people that make this all possible for us. And if you look right here, you see our modern day community. This is us gathering acorn to make acorn flour for acorn soup and acorn bread just a few months ago when cases were lower and we were able to gather together. Now, we started this work with makamham, which in Chochenyo language means our food, because as young people, we got to see the success of our elders in keeping our culture strong and able to see healing happen. An example of this is when we were both young people, we saw how it could be going from having no first language speakers, but our elders holding on to the memory close to their heart of our language and never letting that go, documenting everything that they could. And then when it was safer, we saw a revival of our language, where now we have conversationally fluent speakers, a community where babies are growing up with our language. And elders are able to remember those old words and see them respected and be a part of the leaders of this revival that's happening, that's been so successful. We saw our stories get revived. We saw our religion grow stronger, land stewardship practices become stronger, old village names come back again within our lifetimes. We saw these old ways that were never really lost. In some cases, maybe they were sleeping. But that means that they could be reawakened again, brought into our lives and practiced to the fullest. Our elders make this possible. And this work that we do, we have to acknowledge that it's only possible because of those memories of the generations before. They're the leaders in this. We're just doing what we know we should be doing. But we have to talk about the cultural components, and we want to share a clip from our language classes that we're having every week as well. Computer, yes. Orshetuhi.
Orshetuhi.
Makin aloni suyakma.
Makin aloni suyakma.
Makin non wente horshe maknono.
Makin non wente horshe maknono.
So what we're saying is, hello, we're Ohlone family. We're speaking our beautiful language. And this work with Makamham, of course, it's centered partially on food, but it touches on every other aspect of our traditional culture and our language. It's a big centerpiece of this. The land that we come from, of course, is what constantly is inspiring us. This land that our people have always lived in, that's long protected us. In September 2017, we wanted to organize this work. So we created an organization called Makam Ham. And we did this because we wanted to listen to those old memories that our elders have of our traditional Ohlone foods, the foods that they ate growing up from their parents over on the old rancheria. And we wanted to learn about those old foods and be able to see them grow stronger. We know how much our elders miss these foods. When they talked about them, you could tell that they craved them. They talked about them with so much love, with so much respect, with so much fineness. And we also know that our family recorded a huge amount in the 1920s in archives of old recipes of these foods, talked about how much they miss them, talked about how delicious they are, where their families would be able to find them, cultivate them, how they would have those controlled burns that were later outlawed by Peter Burnett and the American government and California state government in the 1850s. But those burns that would lead to so much more abundance as well, and also nurture the interconnectedness of plant communities and also other life all around. This work that we created with Makam Ham, it was immediately multifaceted, meaning it was centered on all of these different aspects of culture, on old stories, on language, being able to see these traditional foods become more accessible, go up into the hills and gather them together as a family, use language together as we're doing that, be able to find alternatives because we're an urban people in our homeland. There's just here in the East Bay, 3 million people living here. And there is 1,000 people in our community, in our specific East Bay community. Now, if you look at the Bay Area, 7 million people. If you look at the entire Ohlone community, 5,000 Ohlone people as a whole. So we're an extreme minority within our own places. But sometimes that means we have to create alternatives. And those alternatives, whether it means growing our own watercress, for an example, or our sage teas, being able to find some of our greens at the farmer's market and develop relationships in meaningful ways like that. And then, of course, being able to encourage our family members to grow these foods at their own homes as well. So this has showed us that it's possible to have these foods on the table in a regular way, but we wanted to have these foods also be able to find a way to come to the table with more frequency. And by being able to have regular cookie classes with our family, we saw that these foods can easily be shared. We can make dishes together, and this could become a regular part of our cultural component, which has been really fun and really exciting. So this work was happening and ongoing. We know how isolating it could feel within our own home to not see our culture reflected or represented. Growing up here in my homeland, I remember all the time when I would tell people I was Ohlone, people would say, "Oh, I thought all the Ohlones were extinct." Same Lewis says as well, which I know is true. Now, knowing that there's these hardships that we had to experience as young people with misconceptions, ignorance, and invisibility that's there, we always wanted to be able to teach people of the beauty of our culture, but on our own terms. I worked for 7 years at Mission Dolores in San Francisco as one of the museum directors, because I wanted to work to try to teach about how our culture survived in a place that often people don't understand it, to talk about our strength, our resilience, our power. But I noticed that the mission for me when I worked there, it came with so many different emotions, and it wasn't a place that I wanted to be all the time, because it was also a place where my ancestors and Lewis's ancestors, where they suffered, where many of them as well died, where many of them were abused. We don't want to feel so forced to be connected to these colonial institutions in order to tell our story. We wanted to think of something that was like a post-mission reality for us. And so we wanted to create a space where our community could come, where they could feel safe, where they could see their foods reflected, where we could be able to have our language on the menus, have our art on the walls, have our elders at the head of the table, bring in basket weavers to talk about our baskets, abalone cutters to show their finery, be able to have it as a launching pad for our gathering trips up into the hills, be able to have it on a space that's on our terms, where we create that space where we know that our values are being reflected. An opportunity came up to be able to craft that space in the back of University Press Books, just across from UC Berkeley on Bancroft Way, which became Cafe Ohlone, where that space happened, where we could share the beauty of our foods. We say, "Makamham hina pahosi makwara." Our food, it looks like the land. Now, these foods reflect the original foods of this place, foods that have always been eaten here, flavors that have always been eaten here. This is our traditional acorn bread, shetnen, or in Rumsen, pulum. And this is a bread that goes all the way back to our creation days. It's a bread that we love, that we cherish. And when we eat it, it's the exact same flavor as our ancestors that they tasted. We also want the public to know as well that our culture, it's not locked into just one period of time. And so here is traditional acorn bread that we still savor, that we still love, that the future generations will as well. And here's acorn flour brownies as a way to show something contemporary, where we are able to develop a relationship. We have developed a relationship with indigenous people who are in Oaxaca, and they make chocolate in the traditional way that's done in Mexico. And there's a woman, Doña Margarita, she sends up a shipment regularly to Cafe Ohlone, and it's a way for us to be able to keep those connections strong as well with other indigenous communities. Now, chocolate wasn't native here, but when it was introduced here, it was something that was embraced pretty quickly into our traditional diet. So it's important to remember adaptations happen, that we're not locked into one period of time. We like to think about what those changes would look like on our terms. That's also a chia seed porridge that we're going to be making together in just a few moments. Having our teas, we wanted to celebrate these traditional teas that our elders remember, like the rosehip teas, being able to see visibility come, like being named one of the top 100 restaurants by the Chronicle. We say this, of course, not to boast, but we say it because we deserve to have a place in these forums, to know that our food is being respected, to know that these foods are being celebrated, that the public knows that the first cuisine, the original cuisine of this place, California cuisine, which isn't the modern day notions, but I mean indigenous California cuisine, that these foods are alive and that the people who make them and who've always made them are alive as well. The San Francisco Chronicle, they named us one of the top 100 restaurants, which I found, both of us found, especially wonderful, because the San Francisco Chronicle, for so many years, over and over, they would write about the last Ohlone person who passed away. They did it in the 1890s, they did it in the 1910s, they did it in the 1930s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s. They just kept writing about the last Ohlone person who passed away. But we still kept existing, so we didn't go anywhere, right? But one of the things that comes full circle is now the Chronicle has this wonderful food critic, Soleil Ho, and Soleil has been really focused on bringing equity into how foods are described and talked about. And we're really grateful to be able to see this change happen. Being able to see our food featured in the New York Times, reminding that California cuisine isn't often as it's presented, but that California already has a cuisine that's indigenous here. And always just being able to celebrate, being able to hire our community members to come in, being able to always have our aesthetics being represented, and seeing our elders made happy. You want to talk a little bit about Lydia before we?
This is Lydia Bajorquez, and she's an elder in the Rumsen Ohlone community, a relative of mine. And she is of that generation who knew elders. Her elders were speakers of our language, prepared these foods. Sometimes they did these things in secret, though, so that she only got to have glimpses of those things. Because that generation lived through these incredibly traumatic times. And so when she grew up, those people were still around who knew those things, who knew these foodways. And she also recorded them. She documented her great-grandparents' generation, her grandparents' generation, sometimes against their will, to make sure that these things could be remembered. She never wanted them to be stuck in that pain. And for her, you see here at a meal that we had presented at the Cache Creek Conservancy near Woodland, where we had 10 courses of traditional Ohlone foods. You just see this peaceful joy that she has as she's enjoying these foods. And she tells us that the pain that our family suffered before, she knows that pain. She knew those people. She knew why they made the hard choices that they made, why our language has to be relearned, why these foods have to be restored. But she also tells us that this is healing when we do this, that we also heal those people who suffered in that way. And the peace that she feels they also have in them. And so she's just a wonderful example of those bridges that are in our families that connect us to those people and who made it possible for us to do this work and for us to make sure that we do our part to make sure that these things continue forever.
Thank you. That's beautifully said.
Thank
So
you.
happy to share this. You can learn more about our work at Makam Ham, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. We're so inspired. We're going to take a 9-minute break. We're going to come back at 7:15, and Louis and Vincent are going to cook with and for us. And then we're going to resume with a conversation and bring Elizabeth back. We'd like to invite you to put questions into the chat during the break, and then Louis and Vincent might be able to address them while they're cooking or in conversation with Elizabeth. So we'll see you back at 7:15. Thank you. Okay. I hope everybody's had a good break. I'm going to start the recording again. I'm going to invite Vincent and Louis to come back. Got some questions in the chat if you guys want to preview them, a few questions. We can come back to those. But we've got about 10 minutes for cooking and about 15 minutes for conversation with Elizabeth. And then we're going to invite you to talk to us about how we can become an ally to your work and be an informed and thoughtful guest on native land. And then we're going to have a homeroom where students are going to get a chance to talk about what they've heard tonight and digest it.
Wonderful. Well, as soon as we're ready, we could start the cooking demonstration.
Please do.
Okay, so Louis is also, is there a way to make Louis a co-host or spotlight, excuse me, because he's right there on the food. Perfect. Okay, so for this time that we have together, it's a shorter time. So we wanted to make something that we could show you in the time that we have, the 10 minutes, which is going to be pati, which is a chia seed porridge that we serve at Cafe Ohlone. And we're going to show how we make it, which is a little bit different than how it's often made. But chia seed porridge, it comes with a lot of historic and cultural context for us. Chia seeds, pati in our language, in Chocheño, they're seeds that have always been celebrated and gathered here in the East Bay throughout much of Central California. And chia seeds, one of those foods that give us a lot of endurance, give us energy, not because they have caffeine, but because they have really high in nutrients. They have a lot of protein, a lot of good fats, omega-3s, and our runners, before we had email and texting and everything, thousands of years ago, one way that important messages would be conveyed is there would be runners that would drink a mixture of water and chia seed for the long runs. And the chia seed would become gelatinous, and it would propel people to have fuel for those long runs as well. So we eat this food as a breakfast, but we also eat it as a dessert after a heavy meal. And chia seed, we try to gather our native chia seeds as much as possible. We grow some here at home. And also it could be, you could use the Western chia seeds that we're going to use in this one here. by Western, I don't mean, I just mean chia seeds that come from South America or in some cases Mexico. Now these, the way that we're going to make this is we have our chia seeds. It's 1 cup of chia seed to 4 cups of liquid. So it's always going to be 1 to 4. And you want to start off with the dry chia seeds as the base. And at that point, if you want to add any flavoring to that, any dry ingredients, this is when you would do that. So Lewis has a mussel shell that's here full of ground vanilla. And we, again, will here and there add modern day touches to our foods because we cater these flavors to our living community. Lewis is going to put that ground vanilla in there, and using the dogwood acorn whisk, which is traditionally used to whisk acorn soup, but it's also used to make chia seed porridge. We're going to make sure everything is thoroughly mixed together so that all of the dry ingredients are combined fully. Now, as this gets mixed, we're going to share an almond milk, excuse me, a walnut milk that's going to be binding the chia seeds and helping them expand. Now, if you like, you could use an almond milk, you can use oat milk, you could use really any nut milk that you want. We will often make black walnut milks, and often if we can't find that, walnut milk will do the trick as well. It has a very similar flavor. But we want to mix that in very, very slowly. And as we're whisking, make sure that, that every seed gets covered with the milk as well. So Lewis is he's slowly pouring that and making sure that every chia seed is drenched. Because if it's not drenched at this point, you'll have lumpy chia. And in our family, we say nobody wants lumpy chia. So make sure your chia, it's entirely whisked together, combined with the liquid. If there's any clumps of the dry ingredients that are still there, try to break them apart. And at this point, you just want to go slow and make sure that you keep continuously stirring. We say hikue in Chochenyo, which is to stir. Now, at this point as well, you're going to start to see the seeds, the chia seeds, because they will expand, they're gelatinous. They'll start to lose their outer shell. And when that happens, the chia seed will become thicker and thicker in the liquid. And as you are stirring the chia, you'll notice that it begins to take on a different texture that's there. So you don't want to stop stirring it. You just want to continuously stir it. That's there. Now, some of our native sweeteners that we use is we often will add candy cap mushrooms to our dishes for sweetener. And candy caps, they have this wonderful flavor. They're like maple syrup and brown sugar, so sweet and so fragrant as well. And we'll add one of those candy cap mushrooms just into the chia seed porridge and let that soak in there so that it will take on the sweetness of that mushroom as well. So that's a natural sweetener that we use, that we just love the flavor of. So Lewis is continuously whisking this, and as he's seeing it get thicker, soon we'll plate it as soon as it gets thick enough. And the way that we serve it at Cafe Ohlone or at home is with a little bit of a sweet topping. So we'll make, for an example, a blackberry bay laurel sauce that's made with bay laurel from the hills that we gather. And we also want to make it clear we don't encourage folks to go out gathering, because where we gather from, they're in really sensitive areas that our family has literally always gathered. And often when people gather without knowing how to, it can cause a lot of damage to these plant communities. So we want to be mindful of that. But we'll gather our blackberries and we'll gather our bay laurel or California strawberries when they're available, and cook those down until it makes a wonderful sauce that gets sweetened with the bay laurel as well, and then blended down or sometimes mashed down to have some texture. But we'll add that to the chia seed porridge. But today we're going to be adding some rosehip jam, which we eat a lot at home. Rosehips, mamakwa in our language. They're a traditional food that are so high in vitamin C. Our elders, they love the flavor of rose hips. Also, interestingly, because rose hips are so high in vitamin C and they build collagen, our ancestors traditionally washed their faces with a very strong rosehip tea to keep looking fresh, which is a reminder that people always like looking good here in this area. That's nothing new either. So we're going to take out the chia seed porridge now at this point. And I think it's thick enough, is it? Yep. So at this point, it's just about thick enough. So you see how quickly the chia seed expands. And we're going to top that with a little bit of that rosehip jam. But we also have honey you could top it with as well. If you like agave, if that's your thing, or if even some kind of a syrup. We don't really say put sugar in it because that changes the texture. But a syrup works really well on top for a little bit of extra sweetness. And also we'll add some dried California strawberries and also some crushed walnuts to the very top. And the textures all work together really nicely. And this is a dish that we just really love to share with our family, with our community. And we're grateful to be able to share this dish and how we make it at Cafe Ohlone as well. So Louis is just finishing off. Thank you to Louis for demonstrating this so well. And at this point, we'll stop and we could start to answer some questions.
My gosh, I've been making it the lazy way all this time and just putting it in a jar and putting it in the refrigerator and being like, I wonder why mine doesn't turn out as nice. Well, because I wasn't over here whisking it all cute like Louis. I have learned a thing or three, and I never would have thought to put a mushroom in there. Yeah. So bay laurel is one thing y'all can go be foraging because bay trees are everywhere. But yes, I have been out with these guys when they're just trying to gather a few things and they got 100 people stopping along the way and be like, what you got there? What's going on? Vincent has to say, no, this is not for you. Stay out of here. So yeah, I'm happy to have our heads here on the screen, even though we usually have much more fun hanging out eating in person. But one of the things that I was wondering to kind of tie together our two presentations is, what do you think food sovereignty looks like for Ohlone people? And where do you think chefs fit into this vision of Ohlone food sovereignty?
Well, food sovereignty for us, I believe so that's a very complex answer that I know we don't have the time that we need to fully answer that, but I'm going to try my best. It's being able to see the old ways restored to their fullest, which means being able to have no restrictions on what we can do within our own homeland as an extension of our sovereignty. Now, when the Spanish came in, they tried to ban our people from gathering our traditional foods, and they seized huge amounts of land that later became these ranchos, that later became the private lands that we see today that are all within our traditional homeland. Now, when we know the history of being disenfranchised from our own places, and even when we've had land, for an example, that was supposed to be protected, having that taken then by white Americans and seized, like there was a place right here named in the San Lorenzo Rancheria that many of my family was born on in the mid 1840s. But it also is the place literally within the same area where there's the old areas that our family has always lived in. So when you look at it, we've consistently been right here. Now, when Americans came in, they pretty violently tried to remove our people from this area, and they walled off our creek, San Lorenzo Creek. They literally constructed a wall so that our people couldn't access water. That was at the same time that Peter Burnett, the first American governor of California, said in 1852, there has to be a war of extinction against the Indian race until the race becomes extinct. His words were backed up by millions and millions of dollars and bounties. And then also our controlled burns were banned. And it was also written that if any Native person in California, any Indian person, wasn't working for a white person, then they were seen as being a vagrants and they could be held against their will in bondage. Now, if you look at all those things, those laws were systematically passed to hold down our community and to stop our community from having access. Those laws weren't repealed until what was it, the 1920s? 37, excuse me. So you see how late that those laws were repealed and how hard that impacted our direct family. If you could imagine being an Ohlone person, trying to go up into the hills, into your village sites to gather your foods, but those lands are said to be on in the titles of a white landholder who's racist and could legally kill you for just doing those things. Now, of course, we're living in much safer times than our great-grandparents lived under, but we're still living in a time of colonization. It's not over either. We see this happen when we know our controlled burns are still banned, when we can't gather wherever we want to gather, where so many of our traditional lands are constantly being either desecrated or they're constantly being developed, which is also a form of desecration when it's done in a way that tries to remove our history from this area. So we know that there's roadblocks that are there. So for us, being able to see our food sovereignty grow, and what food sovereignty means for us is being able to see the old ways restored to their fullest. We don't want to take scraps of what we know we actually deserve. And until that happens, because we're hopeful that it will happen one day, we're here for the big picture, we're not going anywhere. And if it's not in our lifetime, it might be in our children's, our grandchildren's, our great-grandchildren's, but we know that we're never going to leave this space. And until full sovereignty returns, we know we have to be able to find ways to keep these ways going strong, even if it means creating alternatives, even if it means being able to find new ways of doing these older things. And that's what we're doing.
Awesome. So there were, oh yeah, did you want to add anything, Louis? We don't want to leave your thoughts out here.
Well, I think, one thing that we do, and that we do with so much care and joy, is, to craft space by making food, right? So to make a space that feels safe for members of our community, that feels celebratory of our culture, to treat those elders with so much respect and just give them a joyful experience, to make sure if they want seconds or thirds, they get it, right? And that just does something for our people that's very hard to quantify or sometimes to describe, but it is such an important psychological, emotional, and spiritual thing that we can do by making these safe and celebratory spaces. And then just as a matter of course, the public get to also enjoy the food.
Which I think is very generous of you to also share with the public. And I know I have on a number of occasions benefited from the kindness of being able to sit at these meals and then fill my purse with leftover acorn breads. There were a few really interesting comments and questions that came in over the chat as well. M. Gallegos mentioned that in one of their classes, they did a project of ideas on how we could begin to decolonize campus. My suggestion was Cafe Ohlone taking over Golden Bear Cafe. Then the Ohlone community and anyone on campus would have access to food traditional to the land and direct access to Gen Ec and DSP centers. What do you all think of that? Would you have any interest in coming to Berkeley campus? Or are you like, I don't know about this place? There's a lot of ancestors still tucked up in there.
We think about the relationships that we developed on campus, and we have a really interesting, complex relationship with the university. And the university, in its modern days, it's actually making some very positive changes that we're hopeful for. We also don't want to erase the harder parts of our history with UC Berkeley and not ignore those things either, such as the desecration that the university has done to sacred sites, such as our direct ancestors being kept there, our shell mounds being looted by the university in the 1950s and 1910s. The fact that the university is a land grant institution that tried to actually seize land from our folks for the university to be there. And then also the fact that the university really did a lot of harm when it came to taking away our federal recognition, with Alfred Kroeber saying that we were extinct. Now, those are real challenges that are there. And we also know that we don't want to stay locked in a place of anger forever either, but we expect the university to do the right thing. And if the university did find a way to extend an opportunity where we could come to campus, that's something that we would be willing to think about, because in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of change happen on campus. For an example, we've seen linguistics become accessible to Native people, conferences held on campus for Native language revival, more access to our baskets than the Hearst, conversations starting about being able to see acknowledgement and visibility on campus for our people. So we want people to know that these things exist, that we exist, that we've never left, but not to ignore those wrongs that happened. But if the university did that, that would be something that would make good on their efforts to make more visibility and space for Ohlone people on campus. And that's something that we would be open to thinking about. Thank you for that thought, who wrote that comment. That was very kind.
No, and I think that's a great answer, because I think it's good for us to always remember these institutions have long histories, and they can't just be, it's not just about taking a guy's name off a building to erase all the damage that was created. There's other aspects of reparation that have to happen. So thank you for that thorough answer. Another question that came in was from Sophia, who wanted to know, what do you think is the biggest difference between the Ohlone relationship with food and the land and the Western/industrial view? As a follow-up, is Western food system an appropriate description, given that Ohlone people have always been here in the West all along? And this is something I always grapple with in my teaching and thinking about what is Western from where? I hate this, like, oh, we're in the new world. Like, hey, this world's the same age as the other side of the planet. So new to who and west of where is always a question, right? But I think we know what Sophia means, and we see what they're grappling with here. But what do you think are some of the biggest difference between Ohlone relationships with food and the land and this kind of more industrial food system that many people rely on to eat?
Well, I think one of the biggest things, well, there's so many differences, but one of the things that immediately come to my mind is the understanding that our role as people, that we're part of a much larger system that's there, and that it's not just centered on us as humans. And one thing that we always we wish that we could see come back are those old burns. Because when those burns would happen, for an example, it was, of course, partially for gathering traditional foods and seeing foods grow stronger, but it was also for other reasons. It was to see basketry materials grow stronger. It was to make space for hunting, for meadows. It was to be able to ensure that those large burns that we're seeing nowadays happen, that they wouldn't happen, because our ancestors always knew that California is a place that needs to be burned. They have to have those literally prescribed burns regularly. Otherwise, what we're seeing today happens, which is these massive wildfires that turn the sky orange, and we can't breathe. Our ancestors, they knew so much, and when we look to them, we always know that they're the ones that have the answers. With those old burns, it would allow these interconnected communities to be able to grow stronger. Again, remembering that it's not just about even foods that we would necessarily go out and gather as food plants, but other communities that are also worthy of just being tended for the sake of being tended and taken care of, just because they exist, not only because of what they could provide you, right? But also just for the sake that that plant has a role in the world. And it might be an animal, for an example, that is able to eat a plant that's not edible to humans, but the animal needs that plant tended to. And that has a ripple down effect on us eventually, but on the entire landscape that is this place. So understanding, and this is something that goes all the way back into our original teachings, into our creation, is that we're taught that we were created here after the waters receded, after the great flood, and the only land that was dry were the peaks of Tushtak, of Mount Diablo. Now it's called Tushtak, is what we call it, the place of the day. But before we humans came onto the scene, there was all of this existence that happened before us. There was a time of giants when they were roaming the land. There was a time that animals could talk. There was a time of where these plant communities were being established. There was a time that the world was made safe, right? And then we came later, but we're not the center of it all either. We have a role. And I think that that's something that differentiates us from this commodification of Euro-American food plants, or whatever you want to call it. But our way is different, and it works for right here. As far as Western, I'm going to be honest, I use Western often to mean like Western European or American, but I like the idea of reclaiming that, because we're as Western as it gets, huh? I mean, beyond Hawaii and all of that, like we're pretty Western. So, but we're literally, as you want to talk about the Rumsen Kire? Oh, at the edge.
Oh, the Uchar, the edge of the world.
Yeah, it's said to be like the edge, like the very last place of the coast. So
in our last couple of minutes before everybody goes to their homeroom, can you talk a little bit about how to be a good ally and guest here on native land? So for this whole class of 140 plus folks who want to go forth and be excited now from your remote gastro diplomacy, what do you recommend for people to be good allies now? You can't withhold their brownies like you would in the cafe, but.
Yeah, Chia.
Well, something that we will always tell people at Cafe Ohlone, and also whenever we lecture or talk about our story, is that once you know certain facts, you can't unknow them. Once you know about the existence of our community, you can't go back to a time of not knowing that. Once you know some of these harder facts about how there was a genocide legalized by the same state government that we live with today, that you can't unknow those things of disenfranchisement. So we ask people, once you know these things, to share them, to share that we're here, to share that our culture is alive, and also to understand this place in a fuller way. To know that even if you might see concrete on the ground, that this is always an Ohlone place. To know that when you look up into the hills and you see the abundance, that's literally an extension of the work that our family has been doing for thousands of years. That abundance that's here, that's been shaped by the hands of our family for thousands and thousands of years, and we still see that in action. When you know these things, it helps you understand the long existence of our people right here. To know that this is an old place, an ancient place, and again, has its own way of doing things and carrying itself. We also ask you to, beyond just doing that, to, if you hear people in your circles that really start to ever talk about us, but spread misinformation or things that they might not know anything about just because they might have heard it. Or one of the things that really gets me is when people start talking about our culture, even when we're right in front of them, and they'll start talking about our culture in the past. Oh, so you used to eat those. Oh, so you lived in a certain place. It's like, we still eat these things and we're still right here. We still carry on these traditions. We ask you to nudge whoever might spread misinformation, if they're talking about us in the past, to nudge them into the present. Because when people know that we're here in the present, they're more likely to respect us and more likely to respect the oldest existence of this place. When they know that we're here, they're less likely to desecrate our shell mounds, less likely to remove our ancestors' cemeteries for short-term development of condos and stores that will probably be gone in 50 years or so. But knowing that that history that's in the ground, that's still sacred and alive, that's something that needs to be protected. to be able to make good on the university doing the right thing when it comes to repatriation of our ancestors, or being able to take a stance on things even like their role in federal recognition and how that impacted our family. To be able to know, again, that this is an Ohlone place. And we want those who are here to, by listening to our words, to share this information and understand this place in a fuller way, in our history here and our future.
Amazing. And you ended just right in time for a homeroom breakout. So well done.
Well, thank you. It's been really a gift to have you all here with us today. I'm really touched. I think, Vincent, your call to us to acknowledge and recognize that now that we have new information and the transmission of your wisdom, which comes through many generations, it's really our responsibility now to carry that in a new way. It's really, I feel it as an invitation to transformation. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Vincent and Louis, and of course, Professor Hoover. We're really gifted to have such articulate, thoughtful, caring scholars and leaders, really, of this work. So just want to thank you. I want to invite all the students, turn on your microphones, please turn on your cameras, please thank our guests for being with us today.